This lecture is on bronchi and bronchioles. So, as it enters the lungs, then each primary bronchus, I hope you remember primary bronchi, those are, you have two, one enters each lung, so each primary bronchus then gives rise to secondary bronchi, that enter the lobes of the lungs. And the secondary bronchi, and I should explain here when I say they enter the lobes of the lungs, what I mean is that you have one secondary bronchus per lobe. So as I said, this is how you wind up getting the air to each of the separate lobes of the lung is by each individual secondary bronchus. So the secondary bronchi then divide repeatedly. So these intrapulmonary bronchi, now take a look at the word here. Intra then means within, pulmonary has to do with lungs. So intrapulmonary bronchi are the bronchi inside your lungs. That is to say, everything but the primary bronchi. So these intrapulmonary bronchi then are structured differently. From the primary, that is to say, your extra pulmonary bronchi. So first, then, there are bands of smooth muscle on the inside of the lumen. The lumen, as you recall, is the opening. What is this saying? It's saying that on the inside of each of these bronchi inside the lungs, then, there is going to be smooth muscle on the inside there. And these can contract, that is to say. Okay, let's call it contract. I prefer that term because that's what muscle does. So these can contract, as muscle does, and create folds of tissue then on the insides of the bronchi. Okay, what did I just say? It goes like this. Take a slice through a tube. So here we have a tube. We're going to take a sagittal section through it. So here we have a tube. Now, here we have the lining of the tube. It's a bronchus now. So suppose now you have smooth muscle going along the side like this. So when that contracts, then there's other tissue mixed in there as well. So what can happen then, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that it's a little bit easier to see, is that you go from having these nice smooth bands of muscle instead to having this muscle contracting and therefore bunching up the other tissue that comes with it. It's kind of like pulling a thread in a shirt. Basically, if you pull one thread, you can wind up with the rest of the material bunching up. Now imagine that as smooth muscle. When you have smooth muscle basically contracting, then it's going to bunch up the rest of the tissue with it like this. So you can wind up creating these folds on the inside of the bronchi. And then if the folding is excessive, then the passageways are blocked. You can see how if this folding gets bad enough, then the air cannot pass through that, what should be the lumen, what should be the air opening there. So if the folding is excessive, the passageways are then blocked, and breathing is interfered with. And maybe this sounds familiar to some of you. This is asthma. So that's what asthma is. Asthma is just these smooth muscles contracting and bunching up the soft tissue inside some of the bronchi. And the problem with smooth muscle, as you know, is that it is not under voluntary control. So you cannot actually simply by force of will or training stop that smooth muscle from doing what it's doing. It is not under voluntary control. So we are still talking about the differences between the extrapulmonary bronchi and the intrapulmonary bronchi. So discussing still intrapulmonary bronchi then. We have the smooth muscle on the inside. But the intrapulmonary bronchi, then carrying on with their structure then, are no longer surrounded by cartilage C's, what I call cartilage C's, those C-shaped rings of cartilage. Sorry, there we go. Those C-shaped rings of cartilage are no longer there. They're in the trachea and the primary bronchi, but not in any of the intrapulmonary bronchi. But they do have irregular blocks and bands of cartilage. Around the outside. Lending support. And then the farther along the branches of the bronchial tree. So the further along you go into the smaller and smaller branches of the bronchial tree, the smaller and smaller the cartilages become. So when the diameter of the passageway has narrowed to about, I'm going to say approximately here, that's how I say approximately, to approximately 1 millimeter. The cartilages disappear. So when they get to be this narrow, you no longer have any cartilage support around them. So at this point, when the cartilages have gone, when they have gotten this narrow, then at this point, the bronchi are called bronchioles. So there are your bronchioles, 1 millimeter or less in diameter and with no cartilaginous support. Okay, so each bronchiole, now these small without cartilage air tubes now, each bronchiole enters a single lobule of the lung. and then within the lobule, the bronchiole branches further, giving rise to several what are called terminal bronchioles. Now you would think with a word like terminal that would mean that it was the end of the line, but it's not. You might want that to be the case, it would make sense, but terminal bronchioles are not your smallest bronchioles. I'm pointing this out simply so that you can avoid confusion. So we now have terminal bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles then have a diameter of less than half a millimeter. So at this point, there are few cilia. Remember cilia? Cilia are these things then that are inside your trachea, and they go down through all of those tubes until you get this far, and they are there to basically waft materials upwards, so that, remember, you have mucus, which is sticky, you have cilia, so that if particulates or bacteria or viruses or other things wind up sticking to the mucus on the sides of the tubes, you then have the cilia to slowly lift that stuff back up and out so that you can cough it out. When you get to be this small, however, you have very few cilia, and there are no what are called goblet cells or their underlying mucus glands. So the environment on the side of the tube is very different now. You now don't have the cilia, you no longer have the sticky mucus, and so stuff that gets down there is in a different situation. It's not going to be pulled out in the same way. So each terminal bronchiole gives rise to several respiratory bronchioles. So now, finally, The respiratory bronchioles then are the finest branches of the bronchial tree. So now we've gotten down to the smallest tubes. So it is the respiratory bronchioles then that deliver air. We're finally getting down to delivering air to the respiratory surfaces of the lung, which is where gas exchange takes place. So finally, we have the respiratory bronchioles, the finest branches of the bronchial tree, and now they are the ones that are actually going to be finally delivering the air to your respiratory surfaces, and that's the subject of the next lecture.